There is a comfortable lie we all tell ourselves when we step off the pavement and into the trees. We tell ourselves that the wilderness is pure. That it is a place of peace, a sanctuary from the noise of the modern world. We pack our expensive gear, lace up our boots, and walk into the green shadows, believing we are simply visitors in an empty cathedral. But the woods are not empty. When you strip away the cell service, the streetleted, and the safety nets of civilization, you are no longer at the top of the food chain. You are isolated. You are exposed. And sometimes, you stumble into places that belong to something or someone else. Tonight, we are journeying deep into the backcountry. We have 3 stories of survival from the remote corners of the American wilderness. 3 harrowing reminders that when you wander off the marked trail, you might just find exactly why those trails were marked in the first place. Lock your doors, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Story 1. The Monongahela Severance. Picture the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. It is an ancient, sprawling expanse of Appalachian wilderness. For a hiker with 6 years of solitary backcountry experience under his belt, it's a playground. Our narrator was precisely the kind of hiker. He was comfortable enough in his own skin and his own survival skills to abandon the heavily trafficked routes. He craved absolute, unfiltered solitude. It was October. The weather was a crisp, overcast 50-something degrees. A heavy, bruised sky hung over the canopy, trapping the damp chill in the air. For the first 4 hours, the hike was flawless. Just the rhythmic crunch of boots on fallen leaves and the quiet hum of the forest. Then, the terrain fractured. He arrived at the lip of a steep gorge. It was the Grand Canyon, but it was a jagged, 30 to 40 foot drop into a rocky ravine carved out by a shallow, winding creek. A fall wouldn't necessarily kill you, but it would shatter your legs, leaving you to die of exposure. The walls were steep, layered with crumbling shale and treacherous overhangs. Climbing down was suicide. But bridging this massive gap was a titan of the forest. A massive, ancient oak tree had uprooted and fallen, wedging itself perfectly between the 2 cliffs. Its bark had been worn completely smooth by years of harsh weather in the boots of passing hikers. It was a natural bridge. He tested it. It felt immovable. Gathering his focus, he stepped onto the slick wood, arms out, eyes locked on the far bank. He took it slow, his heart hammering a steady, thrilling beat. When his boots finally hit solid earth on the other side, a warm rush of adrenaline washed over him. He had conquered it. A sound shattered the quiet. Thwack. A heavy, rhythmic, wooden thud. Thwack. He spun around. Standing on the opposite side of the gorge, the side he had just left, was a man. He was positioned barely 10 feet from where the massive oak gripped the earth. The stranger looked to be in his late 50s, draped in a tattered, faded camouflage jacket and stained denim. A wild, unkempt beard obscured the lower half of his face. But it wasn't the man's ragged appearance that made our hiker's blood run cold. It was the heavy, steel-headed felling axe gripped tightly in his hands. Flake. The man swung the axe, burying the blade deep into the trunk of the oak tree. Our hiker froze, his brain struggling to process the impossible violence of the scene. He shouted across the divide, his voice echoing off the rocks, demanding to know what the hell the old man was doing. The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He just pulled the axe free and swung again. With a sickening crack, the blade bit deeper. The entire length of the massive oak shuddered. The tree shifted, groaning against the stone. Panic ignited. The hiker screamed, his voice cracking, desperately explaining that he had just crossed that tree, that he needed it to get back. But, as the words left his mouth, a horrific realization settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The man already knew. He had waited. He had watched the hiker cross, bided his time, and stepped out specifically to sever the only bridge back to safety. He was intentionally trapping him in the deep woods. Desperation turned to white-hot fury. Our narrator began hurling insults across the gorge, screaming every foul, chaotic thought that crossed his panicked mind. Finally, the axe-wielding stranger paused. He slowly lifted his head. "That's not my problem." The delivery was what made it so terrifying. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't angry. It was delivered with the casual, deadpan apathy of someone mentioning a slight chance of rain. The sheer indifference pushed our hiker over the edge. He lost his mind, screaming louder, his voice tearing at his throat. Whatever vitriol he unleashed must have finally struck a nerve. The old man abruptly stopped. He rested the heavy head of the axe on the dirt, took a slow, deliberate step toward the precipice, and peered across the gap. For the first time, the hiker could clearly see the man's eyes. They were sunken hollow and ringed with a bruised, sickly darkness. Light, the face of a phantom. The old man leaned forward. His voice carried effortlessly over the ravine. "I know these woods a lot better than you do." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. An absolute, terrifying fact. The two men locked eyes in a suffocating silence that stretched into eternity. Then, without another word, the stranger hoisted his axe, turned his back, and melted into the dense Appalachian shadows. Our narrator stood trembling on the edge. The oak tree was still wedged in the rock, but it was mortally wounded. The trunk was splintered, a deep, jagged wedge missing from its base. It was a death trap. He pulled his phone from his pocket. Light. No bars. Total dead zone. He was trapped. Fighting back a rising tide of panic, he decided to follow the edge of the gorge downstream. Logically, the terrain had to level out eventually. He would find a shallow crossing, loop back to his car, and get the hell out of West Virginia. The logic does not apply to the deep woods. He walked for an hour, the daylight bleeding out of the sky. Instead of narrowing, the gorge only grew wider, the drop more severe. Every bend in the river revealed more impassable, jagged cliffs. The temperature plummeted. The sun dipped below the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor. He was miles from his vehicle, moving in the wrong direction, and staring down the barrel of a freezing night in the wilderness. But then he saw it, a clearing up ahead. Hope briefly flared in his chest. A campsite. Maybe there was another hiker. Maybe there was a fire. He pushed through the brush and stepped into the clearing, but the relief vanished instantly. The air he felt thick, tainted. In the center sat a stone fire ring, filled with fresh ash. But, as his eyes adjusted to the dimming light, he noticed the trees surrounding the camp. The bark had been brutally mutilated. Deep, aggressive gouges were carved into the trunks, forming bizarre, unrecognizable symbols. Scattered around the perimeter were rusted, archaic tools. Filthy strips of ragged cloth hung from the low branches like dead leaves. And on the ground, meticulously arranged into deliberate, geometric patterns, were sun-bleached animal bones. This wasn't a recreational campsite. This was an altar. He backed away, a cold sweat breaking across his skin. His fear, already pushing its limits, doubled in a fraction of a second. He turned on his heel and walked fast, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever madness he had just stumbled upon. Light. Then he heard it. The unmistakable crunch of dry leaves behind him. He stopped. The woods went dead silent. He took 3 quick steps. Crunch, 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 crunch. Something was pacing him, tracking him. His mind raced to predators, a mountain lion, a black bear. He sped up, hoping to outpace the animal. But the sound didn't fade. It amplified. It grew heavier. He threw a frantic glance over his shoulder. A shadow darted behind a thick pine trunk. But it didn't move on for legs. It was a pride. It was human. He froze, his eyes scanning the gloom. To his left, another shape shifted in the brush. They had spread out. He wasn't just being followed. Like, he was being corralled, hunted. The illusion of stealth evaporated. The stalkers stepped out from behind the timber, their heavy boots tramping openly through the brush. The hiker caught a terrifying glimpse of dull metal, a rusted pipe, or a heavy club clutched in a filthy hand. The prey drive kicked in. He ran. He sprinted blindly through the darkening forest, adrenaline flooding his veins. The moment he bolted, the forest erupted. Heavy footfalls thundered behind him. They were giving chase. He didn't know who they were, what they wanted, or where he was going. He only knew that if they caught him, he was going to die. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. He pushed his body far beyond its natural limits, navigating the treacherous, root-choked terrain in near total darkness. Then, from the darkness behind him, a sound ripped through the air. A scream. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a call. It was a raw, guttural, animalistic war cry that vibrated in his very bones. Pure nightmare fuel. His vision blurred from exhaustion. Just as his legs threatened to give out, he spotted it. Another fallen tree, bridging the gorge to his left. It was much thinner than the first oak, frail and precarious. But there was no time to think. No time to test it. He threw himself onto the rotting bark, straddling the wood, and violently shimmied his way across the void. The thin trunk bowed and groaned under his weight. One slip meant broken bones and a slow death. But the terror behind him was far worse. He scrambled onto the far bank, gasping for air, then spun around. Standing on the opposite ledge were three men. In the dying light, they looked like grotesque carbon copies of the lumberjack with the axe. Covered in filth, draped in rags, staring at him with hollow, dead eyes. White, one of them tightly gripped a rusted steel pipe. The leader placed a heavy boot onto the thin tree, testing its weight. He paused, staring across the abyss at the trembling hiker. Then slowly, he pulled his foot back. The three men stood like statues in the gloom. The leader leaned forward. "Get the fuck out of here. You got lucky." The hiker didn't hesitate. He turned and plunged into the dark, expecting to hear them behind him at any moment. But the woods remained eerily, oppressively quiet. He fought through the pitch-black wilderness, battling the urge to break down entirely. By some miracle, or some subconscious sense of direction, he eventually broke through the tree line and found his car. He reported the incident, but deep down, he knew the truth. No badge was going to trek into the darkest quarters of the Monongahela to hunt down ghosts. Months have passed, but the woods are ruined for him. He can't step onto a trail without feeling the phantom weight of those hollow eyes on his back. He realizes now that the old man didn't just stumble upon him. It was a coordinated trap. And if he hadn't found that second fallen tree, his bones might have been the newest addition to that altar in the dark. Story 2. The Stagnant Smoke. Let's travel north, far north, to the deep, unforgiving wilderness of Minnesota. There is a distinct difference between a groomed nature trail and the raw, untamed backcountry. A trail guides you. The backcountry swallows you. 3 years ago, our narrator was hiking off-grid through a remote patch of the Minnesota timberlands. He despised the sanitized version of nature, the wooden signposts, the gravel paths, the safety of the crowds. He wanted the raw isolation of the wild. For hours deep into the brush, the unthinkable happened. He lost his bearing. Normally, an experienced off-trail hiker can recalibrate using landmarks and the sun. But this time, the geometry of the forest felt wrong. Every direction looked identical. A sprawling ocean of ancient pines. The sun was still relatively high, so panic hadn't fully set in yet, but a cold, heavy knot began to form in his stomach. He pushed forward, attempting to maintain a steady pace, trying to force the landscape to make sense. Then he heard the rustling. It was faint, occurring every 30 seconds or so, a dry, rhythmic crunch of dead foliage. He stopped. The rustling stopped. He took a few steps. The rustling matched him perfectly. He tried to convince himself it was a curious deer, but experience told him otherwise. Prey animals don't mirror your movements. They flee. Whatever was behind him was matching his cadence, stalking him. He gripped the handle of his fixed-blade knife, his senses dialed up to an agonizing extreme. Before he could turn to confront his pursuer, the rustling exploded. It wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was coming from all sides. The brush violently parted, and his heart slammed against his ribs. He was completely surrounded. 6, maybe 7 massive timber wolves had silently encircled him. Their coats blended seamlessly with the shadows. A few of them bared their teeth, low, guttural snarls vibrating in their chests. Others simply stared with cold, yellow eyes, calculating his worth. He was boxed in. He was prey. He drew his knife. It was a pathetic defense against a coordinated pack, but he wasn't going to let them take him without spilling blood. The grim reality washed over him. He was going to die here, miles from a marked trail, entirely alone, torn apart in the dirt. He braced himself for the first lunge, but the attack never came. Instead, a bizarre, unnatural synchronization seized the pack. Every single wolf suddenly snapped rigid. Their ears pinned forward, their hackles raised, but they weren't looking at him. Every yellow eye in the pack was locked onto a fixed point deep in the trees, somewhere over the hiker's shoulder. The snarls ceased. The aggression vanished. In perfect unison, the entire pack of apex predators turned and sprinted blindly in the opposite direction, tearing through the brush in absolute, unadulterated terror. They weren't hunting anymore. They were fleeing. The adrenaline spike that had kept the hiker grounded suddenly inverted into a suffocating, paralyzing dread. The moment the wolves vanished, the forest died. The ambient noise of the woods, the rustling wind, the chirping birds, the hum of insects, was instantly muted. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy soundproof blanket over the world. The daylight itself seemed to warp, growing dim and washed out, like the fading vision just before you lose consciousness. Whatever had terrified a pack of timber wolves was now out there in the silence, and it was close. He was paralyzed by an impossible choice: follow the fleeing wolves undressed, getting further lost or ambushed, or walk in his original direction, straight toward the unseen horror that had scattered the pack. Logic, though fragile, dictated he maintain his course toward what he believed was the highway, while he still had daylight. He gripped his knife so hard his knuckles turned white and began to walk. 20 minutes later, the trees parted. He stepped into a wide clearing, and his breath caught in his throat. It looked like a campsite, but fundamentally, viscerally wrong. The tree trunks ringing the clearing were deeply scarred with violent, jagged carvings, patterns that made the eyes ache to follow. Hanging from the low, reaching branches were thick leather cords. Suspended from them were twisted, rusted shards of metal and tiny, fragile animal skeletons. In the dead center of the clearing sat a fire pit, but the stones weren't casually tossed into a ring. They were precariously, impossibly balanced and delicate, towering structures. Inside the ash lay discarded jewelry, rotting cloth, and unfightable trinkets. But none of that was what paralyzed him. Hovering exactly 6 feet above the dead fire pit was a cloud of smoke. It was thick, pitch black, and entirely stagnant. It didn't drift. It didn't thin out into the atmosphere. It just hung suspended in the dead air, a solid, localized mass of absolute darkness. He couldn't look away. His eyes were magnetically locked onto the black void. As he stared, an overwhelming psychological wave crashed into him. He felt an intense, sickening dissociation. He described it as looking out his own kitchen window into a backyard, rather than actually standing in the woods. His body was there, but his consciousness felt detached, separated from reality by an invisible pane of glass. Then came the emotion, a suffocating, crushing weight of grief and sheer terror, blooming simultaneously in his chest. It wasn't a reaction to the smoke. It felt injected into him. He was mourning something terrible that hadn't happened yet. A phantom grief. He stood there, a prisoner in his own mind, staring into the stagnant black smoke for 5 agonizing minutes. Suddenly, the spell broke. A primal, screaming instinct rebooted his nervous system. He didn't back away. He didn't jog. He turned and ran for his life, sprinting blindly through the dense thickets, driven by an apocalyptic panic he couldn't comprehend. What happens next is a blank space. His memory simply shuts off. When reality finally stitches itself back together, it is pitch black. The sun has completely set. He is stumbling through the final stretch of trees, shivering violently in the freezing night air, yet his clothes are entirely soaked in cold sweat. He breaks through the tree line and sees his car. He doesn't look back. He throws himself into the driver's seat, hits the locks, and tears out of the woods, speeding down the empty highway. He never told the authorities. How do you file a police report about missing time, frozen smoke, and a feeling of phantom grief? He knows he could never find that clearing again, even if he possessed the courage to try. But the detail that haunts his quiet moments isn't the carving. It isn't the wolves. It is the amnesia. Human psychology dictates that trauma burns memories into your brain with crystal clarity. You don't forget the worst moments of your life. Unless whatever he encountered in the dark didn't just scare him. It reached into his mind, and it erased what he saw. Story 3. The Ozark Intruders. For our final descent into the dark, we travel south, to the rugged, isolated beauty of the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. When you're young, the world feels conquerable. Teenagers believe they are invincible, cloaked in a protective aura of youth and arrogance. Our narrator was 18, a high school senior. He and his core group of friends, his girlfriend Megan, his buddy Colin, and Colin's girlfriend Anne, were seasoned campers. They spent every free weekend driving out to the wild, pitching tents, and living off-grid. Because their parents knew the remote areas could be dangerous, the narrator was entrusted with a piece of insurance, a Taurus G-C9 handgun. It was February. The deep winter. The Ozarks were stripped bare, the trees skeletal and gray. They drove 9 hours to reach the trailhead, arriving just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. Exhausted, they quickly pitched their tents near the entrance and slept through a quiet, uneventful night. The true isolation began the next morning. They packed their gear and began the deep trek into the mountains, aiming for a secluded natural waterfall. The woods were dead quiet. Halfway down the trail, and suddenly stopped. Her voice was tight with anxiety. She whispered that someone had been following them. She pointed back down the barren path. Standing perfectly still among the dead trees was a man. He wasn't hiking. He wasn't moving. He was just staring directly at them. Colin, flushed with teenage bravado, puffed out his chest and screamed down the trail, threatening to beat the man to a pulp if he took another step. The stranger didn't respond. He simply turned and quickly vanished into the brush. They laughed it off, chalking it up to a weird local, and pushed on to the waterfall. They spent the afternoon taking photos, eating lunch, and reveling in the isolation. As the late afternoon shadows began to stretch, they began searching for a place to make camp. That's when the narrator saw her. Standing amidst a cluster of bare oaks was a woman. but her proportions were profoundly unnatural. She was exceptionally tall, at least 6'5", and impossibly, sickly thin. Her elongated limbs hung awkwardly at her sides. She stood in absolute silence, her eyes locked onto the group of teenagers. A deep, primal unease rippled through the group. The bravado from earlier felt hollow now. The narrator shouted at her, warning her to back off, loudly announcing that they were armed. The towering woman slowly rotated and walked away, melting into the woods without making a sound. Were the man and the woman connected? Or were these woods simply a magnet for the disturbed? They didn't want to find out. They hiked another hour, pushing deeper into the backcountry, finally settling beside a deep, rushing creek. As the sun sank, they built a roaring fire. They cooked chicken, boiled rice, and tried to shake the creeping dread. They broke out the alcohol. Mike, the narrator, a heavy smoker, rolled a joint. The alcohol and the weed did their job, dulling the sharp edges of the day's paranoia. Soon, they were laughing, sharing stories, and slipping into an intoxicated, carefree state. Colin was laughing so hard he tumbled out of his camp chair into the dirt. Around midnight, they retreated to their respective tents. The narrator and Megan were settling into their sleeping bags, the soft murmur of the creek lulling them to sleep. Then a sound cut through the nylon walls. A low, distinct laugh, right outside their tent. Assuming it was his buddy messing with them, the narrator called out, "What's so funny?" From the other tent, several yards away, Cole, and yelled back, "That wasn't me." The remaining alcohol evaporated from the narrator's bloodstream in a microcell. Absolute, stone-cold sobriety hit him like a freight train. He unzipped his sleeping bag, snatched the 9 pistol from his pack, and burst out of the tent into the freezing air. He raised the gun to the black sky and pulled the trigger. Bang! Mike! Bang! Bang! The gunshots deafened the night, echoing violently off the mountain walls. He screamed into the darkness, threatening to kill anyone who stepped into the firelight. From the shadows just beyond the tree line, heavy footsteps violently crunched through the dry leaves, sprinting away from the camp. No one slept. They dragged the 2 tents flush against each other and sat in total silence, taking shifts staring into the black woods until dawn finally broke. The next morning, exhausted and terrified, they debated abandoning the trip. But teenage stubbornness won out. They convinced themselves that the gunshots had permanently terrified whoever was stalking them. They decided to hike closer to the parking lot, camp for one final night, and leave in the morning. They hiked for miles. They passed a few other day hikers, sharing their bizarre encounters, but realized with a sinking dread that despite the packed parking lot, the deep trails were virtually empty. With only 3 miles left to the exit, they made camp. They ate a heavy dinner, drank the rest of their liquor, smoked, and exhausted from the sheer adrenaline drain, fell into a deep sleep. In the dead of night, the narrator woke up. His bladder was painfully full. The fire was dead. The cold was absolute. Paranoia screaming in his ear. He grabbed his headlamp and gripped the 9 pistol in his right hand before unzipping the tent. He stepped into the freezing dark, walking a few paces to the tree line to relieve himself. As he stood there, the silence was broken. What? A deliberate, heavy footstep on dry leaves. Close. Far too close. His heart seized. He zipped up his pants, raised the heavy pistol, and clicked his headlamp on. The blinding white beam pierced the dark, illuminating a figure standing less than 20 feet away. It was the man from the first day. His long, greasy black hair hung in matted clumps over a filthy, gaunt face. But he wasn't just staring anymore. Gripped tightly in his right hand was a massive, rusted machete. The narrator screamed in pure, unadulterated terror. But he charged full speed, the machete raising high into the air, his boots staring up the dirt. The narrator didn't think. He simply squeezed the trigger. Bang, bang, bite, bang, bang. The muzzle flashed strobe D like lightning in the dark. He emptied the entire magazine, firing blindly at the charging mass. Over the ringing in his ears, he heard a guttural shriek of pain. The lanky man crumpled, collapsing hard into the dead leaves, writhing in the shadows. The camp exploded into chaos. Colin made in, and then burst from the tents, screaming, "Pack the bags. No!" The narrator roared, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the empty gun. They didn't break down the tents. They abandoned hundreds of dollars in gear. They snatched their backpacks, clicked on their flashlights, and ran. They sprinted the final 3 miles through the treacherous, pitch-black Ozark terrain in under an hour, driven by a sheer, primal terror that defied physical exhaustion. They burst into the parking lot, threw themselves into the vehicles, and locked every door. They didn't drive. They were too shaken, too terrified of crashing on the winding mountain roads. They covered the windows with blankets and huddled in the freezing cars until the sun finally broke the horizon. They fled the mountains, stopping at a greasy diner hours away just to feel the safety of civilization. They never called the police. The narrator was 18, terrified of being charged with attempted murder or manslaughter in a rural jurisdiction where he was an outsider. He convinced himself the stalker's life wasn't worth ruining his own over. Years have passed. He obsessively scoured the news for months, waiting for a report of a body found in the Ozarks, or a crazed man admitted to a rural hospital with gunshot wounds. But not a single word. He still wrestles with the guilt. Did he leave a man to bleed to death in the frozen dirt? Or did the stalker survive, patching himself up in some rotting cabin, still wandering those dark trails with a machete, waiting for the next group of teenagers to set up camp in the deep woods? We will never notice it before that night. 3 excursions into the wild. 3 terrifying reminders that when you leave the safety of the lights, you enter a world that plays by a different set of rules. Next time you hear a branch snap in the dark, remember, you might not be alone. Sleep tight. Welcome to the podcast. Settle in, turn down the lights, and make sure your doors are locked. We all have our routines. We find comfort in the predictable. We go to the same coffee shops, take the same routes to work, and, for many of us, we sweat it out at the same gyms. The gym is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of self-improvement, headphones in, tuning out the rest of the world. But what happens when that predictable space becomes the hunting ground for an obsession? What do you do when the friendly nod across the weight room turns into a nightmare that follows you home? Tonight, we have 3 true stories of gym encounters that started with simple, everyday interactions and spiraled into terrifying obsessions. Let's dive in. Story 1. The Voices in the Dark. For the sake of our story, we'll call our first narrator Nolan. This nightmare began the way 1,000 harmless gym friendships begin. You know how it is. You show up at the same time, you see the same faces, and eventually, the unspoken rule of the weight room dictates that you stop pretending you're invisible to each other. You share a nod. A casual "what's up?" It's supposed to mean nothing. Nolan was a creature of habit. Every day after work, HED hit the gym. It was the anchor of his day, the one block of time that belonged entirely to him. And sharing that timeline was a guy named Josh. Josh was the kind of guy who made sure you knew he was there you knew. He wore the fitted shirts, constantly carried the requisite shaker bottle, and lugged around a massive duffel bag like he was moving in. He had that restless, coiled energy of someone who desperately wanted to be seen as a serious lifter. At first, their interactions were microscopic. A subtle chin tilt by the dumbbell rack. A brief smile. Josh seemed harmless enough. if a bit overly eager. He acted like they were already close buddies, bridging a gap of intimacy that Nolan hadn't actually invited. Right. Then, the tipping point. Nolan was setting up for the bench press. Josh, already stationed at the adjacent track, caught his eye. "Hey man, mind giving me a spot?" It's the most normal question in the world. Nolan agreed. He stood behind the bench, hands hovering, watching as Josh struggled through his final rep. Nolan helped guide the heavy steel back to the pins. But as soon as Josh sat up, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't just say thank you. He unleashed a torrent of conversation, speaking rapidly, practically buzzing with an intense, frantic energy. He fired off questions like an interrogator. "How long have you been lifting? Wait, what's your split? Where are you from? Wait, where do you live?" Nolan kept his answers vague, giving only his general neighborhood. Josh laughed a loud, forced sound and declared that they lived near each other. To Josh, this geographic coincidence was absolute proof that they were destined to be best friends. Before Nolan could retreat to his own workout, Josh casually thrust his phone forward, asking for his Instagram. Reluctantly, feeling the societal pressure to just be polite, Nolan followed him back. It was just exchanging socials, right? We all do it. Over the next few weeks, the gym stopped being a sanctuary. Josh was always there. HED orbit Nolan, offering unsolicited advice, commenting on his form, acting like his personal coach. Then the direct messages started. Memes, lifting fails, dramatic body ball edits. Nolan would toss back a quick laughing emoji, trying to maintain a polite distance without encouraging him. But Josh didn't want distance. He messaged Nolan about a local town festival that weekend. Food trucks, cheap beer, live music. Against his better judgment, Nolan agreed to go, thinking he could easily vanish into the crowd if things got awkward. When Saturday afternoon rolled around, Nolan met Josh at the festival grounds. If Josh was intense at the gym, out here in the real world, he was completely unhinged. He had no volume control. He greeted Nolan with a painfully hard slap on the back, grinning far too wide. "I did." The voices started. Mid-conversation, Josh's tone would completely fracture. He would slip into high-pitched, nasally cartoon voices, and then suddenly drop into deep, gravelly, scratchy tones. He wasn't telling jokes. He wasn't doing impressions of famous people. He was just speaking normal, everyday sentences, but wearing these bizarre, unnatural vocal masks. It was as if his personality was glitching. As the afternoon wore on and the drinks flowed, the situation deteriorated. Josh's comments grew darker, more wildly inappropriate. He would point at strangers, families, couples, and say horrifying things out loud, purely for shock value. He wanted an audience. He craved the discomfort. Nolan tried to de-escalate. "Hey man, chill out. Calm down." But Josh would just lock eyes with him, smile, and lean in a terrifyingly slow, breathy whisper. He would say, "No LAA." He did it over and over, slipping into that spooky, calculated whisper, tasting the syllables of Nolan's name like it was a private joke. Nolan left after a few hours, deeply unsettled, telling himself the guy was just a socially awkward drunk. But the messages only amplified. Like, the memes stopped. Instead, it was constant surveillance. "What are you doing? Are you at the gym? What are we linking up?" Nolan started pulling back. But Josh had another hook. He invited Nolan to a bar, explicitly promising that two girls were meeting them. A double date. Safety in numbers. Right. Nolan agreed. He arrived at the dimly lit bar to find Josh already deeply intoxicated, eyes glassy and wild. 10 minutes passed. Right. No girls. When Nolan asked about them, Josh waved it off with chilling indifference. They bailed. He didn't care. Nolan's stomach plummeted. He realized right then there were never any girls. It was a trap to isolate him. The night descended into a surreal nightmare. The voices returned, but they were darker now. Fake, hysterical crying. Like manic, exaggerated laughter. Deep, movie villain growls. Josh performed these audio grotesque cries right at the table, loudly disrupting the patrons around them. People stared. The bartender glared. But Josh fed on the awkwardness. And through it all, he kept violently anchoring the conversation back to Nolan. Listen, Nolan. Trapped in a booth with a man rapidly losing his grip on reality, Nolan made his move. He checked his phone and lied, saying his brother needed an emergency favor. Josh's demeanor snapped. The manic energy vanished, replaced by a cold, genuine rage. He stared at Nolan, his face darkening. Why can't you just stay? He demanded. When Nolan stood his ground, Josh muttered something under his breath and let out a single, sharp, angry fake laugh. Nolan turned his back and walked out into the cool night air, feeling the eyes of the entire bar burning into his spine. He thought it was over. He thought the cold shoulder would work. He changed his gym hours, dodging Josh like a phantom. The Instagram messages piled up, unanswered. You good? The notifications became a source of genuine greed. Then came the sweltering summer night that changed everything. Nolan was lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the night breeze. His bedroom was on the ground floor, facing the dark expanse of the backyard. Outside, cutting through the silence of the cicadas, came a voice. It was low, drawn out, intentionally, artificially spooky. No Buel-an. It was right outside the glass. So close, the breath could have fogged the pain. Nolan froze. His blood turned to ice water. The voice stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind. Heart pounding against his ribs, Nolan crept to the window. He peered through the blinds into the pitch-black yard. Nothing. But the air felt heavy. He could feel the malevolence lingering just beyond the glass. Trembling, he opened Instagram. Are you outside my house? A message switched to scene. Seconds ticked by like hours. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, a single word appeared on the screen. Note. Why wouldn't he ask what Nolan meant? Why wouldn't he express confusion? Because he knew exactly what he was doing. The next night, the psychological torture escalated. Nolan heard the voice again. Right. This time, it wasn't right at the window. It was drifting from the deep shadows near the back fence line. No. Oh, they. Slow. Stretched out. A predator playing with its food. Nolan slammed the window shut, locked it, and cranked his fan to maximum. He grabbed his phone, bypassed the questions, and typed a threat. Leave now, or I'm calling the cops and getting a restraining order. Area freak. Blight. But as Nolan lay in the dark, the fan couldn't drown out his paranoia. Driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, he rolled over and parted the blinds just a fraction of an inch. Standing mere feet from the glass, blocking out the faint moonlight, was a solid, motionless shadow. A man. Nolan screamed, slamming his hands against the glass. Get out. Never come back. The shadow shifted, melting seamlessly into the darkness. The aftermath was a masterclass in paranoia. Nolan changed gyms, abandoned his social media, and lived behind locked doors. Weeks went by. The silence stretched out, and he finally began to exhale. Until he walked out to his car one morning. His rear tire was completely flat, slashed. A clean, deliberate slice right through the thick sidewall. Josh was still watching. He was still waiting. Nolan didn't reach out. He didn't give Josh the satisfaction of a reaction. He installed cameras, motion lights, and surrendered his peace of mind to constant vigilance. Because once a predator decides you belong to them, they don't just walk away. Story 2. The Locker Room Echoes. Our second story takes us out of the city and into the quiet, rural expanse of a small town in Kansas. Lewis is 22. For over a decade, this town has been his entire world. It's the kind of place where doors are left unlocked, where everyone knows the cashier at the local Mexican restaurant where Lewis works, and where true crime feels like something that only happens on television. Lewis's daily ritual involved hitting the gym with his 19-year-old buddy, Colton. Colton was your standard country kid, laid back, easygoing, but currently carrying the heavy baggage of a toxic breakup. For 4 agonizing months, Colton had been trapped in a chaotic relationship with a 17-year-old high school cheerleader named Addie. Addie was intensely possessive. She despised the fact that Colton spent his evenings lifting weights with Lewis. She wanted all his time, all his attention, suffocating him until the bitter end, which came crashing down when Colton discovered she had been cheating on him with multiple guys. He cut ties, but Addie was not the type to let go. It was a Tuesday night. The Kansas heat was finally breaking as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lewis and Colton arrived at the gym around 7 p.m. They downed their pre-workout, the caffeine buzzing in their veins, and hit the floor. The heavy glass door of the gym swung open. A girl walked in. She wore a bright red hoodie and tight blue leggings. But she didn't walk to the front desk. She didn't scan the room for a machine. She just stopped dead in her tracks. She stood frozen, her head turned, staring directly at Lewis and Colton. The stillness of her posture was deeply unsettling. After a long, uncomfortable moment, she broke her reds and drifted toward the women's locker room. But her neck remained craned, her eyes locked on the boys until she disappeared behind the heavy wooden door. Colton brushed it off, but Lewis felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. Minutes later, the sounds began. Even over the heavy bass thumping through their headphones, they could hear it echoing from the women's locker room. It was crying, but not the soft, heartbreaking tears of someone who had just received bad news. It was a chaotic, wet, hyperventilating sobbing, punctuated by frantic, whispering voices. It sounded like someone having a violent argument with themselves in the dark. Lewis and Colton exchanged a look. They tried to focus on the iron. 10 agonizing minutes passed. The locker room door slowly creaked open. The girl emerged. She hadn't changed clothes. The red hoodie remained tightly zipped. She didn't approach a single weight. She didn't step on a treadmill. Instead, she began a slow, aimless orbit around the gym floor. With every pass, her radius shrank. She drifted closer and closer, hovering just feet away from whatever machine Lewis and Colton were using. White, silent. The tension was thick enough to choke on. In getting weirded out, Lewis muttered. They moved across the room. When they finally looked back, the girl was gone. No sound of the door opening. No silhouette in the window. Just vanished. They finished their workout in a hurry, stepping out into the cool 8:40 p.m. air. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single truck. White. And a car idling in the shadows, its headlights cutting through the dark. They drove home in silence. 10 minutes after Lewis walked through his front door, his phone buzzed. It was Colton. Did you recognize that girl? Colton asked. What if it was Addie? Lewis's stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. Colton explained that Addie had been spiraling, demanding he take her back, acting entirely erratic. Lewis tried to talk them both off the ledge. No way. Just a crazy coincidence. Go to sleep. At 11, 8:30 p.m., the silence of Lewis's house was shattered. Tap, 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 tap. Fingers against the glass of his brother's bedroom window. Lewis stepped down the hall, holding his breath, peering out into the black yard. Night. Light. Minutes later. Tap, 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 tap. Light. This time, on Lewis's own bedroom window. Before he could process the terror, the front of the house erupted. A violent, aggressive pounding hammered against the front door. The heavy brass doorknob began to violently twist and shake. It wasn't someone checking to see if the door was unlocked. It was someone desperately, furiously trying to rip their way inside. Then, light. The laughter started. It pierced right through the thick wooden door. The girl's laughter. Hysterical. Might. Absolutely devoid of joy. It was the sound of a mind snapping in half. She would pause for a few seconds, letting the silence hang heavy, and then burst into high-pitched, gleeful shrieks. Lewis stood paralyzed in his hallway, feeling physically ill. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. You made him leave me. You made him break up with me. Mate, now you're going to pay the consequences. His phone buzzed again. An image file loaded on the screen. It was a photograph of a hand gripping a massive, razor-sharp kitchen knife. The reality of the situation crashed down on Lewis like an anvil. This wasn't a sad ex-girlfriend crying in a parking lot. This was an armed, unstable predator standing on his welcome mat. He frantically texted his father, who was awake in the master bedroom. Within seconds, his father was on the line with 911. Outside, the laughter abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. Was she finding a back window? Wake? Was she picking the lock? Late. Lewis didn't dare move a muscle. When the red and blue sirens finally washed over the front lawn, casting chaotic shadows through the blinds, the police found her. Addie. She was just sitting peacefully in the damp grass near the porch, waiting in the dark with the blade. She confessed to everything right there on the lawn. She was handcuffed and hauled away. But as Lewis lay awake that night, staring at his ceiling, one terrifying question circled his brain, refusing to let him sleep. He had never given Addie his address. Colton swore he hadn't either. How did she know where he slept? Had she found him once? Who's to say she couldn't find him again? Story 3. The Phantom of the Preserve. Our final story belongs to a 25-year-old woman. 4 years. Her routine was set in stone. Every evening, around 6. Light. Darrow p.m. She would walk through the doors of her local La Fitness. The gym is an ecosystem. You learn the wildlife. The grunteresses, the mirror posers, the headphone zombies. You recognize them all. But about 6 months ago, a new variable entered the equation. She was in the middle of a brutal leg day. She unracked the barbell, dropped into a deep squat, and locked eyes with her own reflection in the wall of mirrors. But in the background of the glass, something caught her attention. Sitting on a chest press machine directly behind her was a man. He wore a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low. He was touching the handles. He was resting between sets. He was sitting completely still, elbows resting on his knees, staring blankly ahead. She finished her set. She looked up. He hadn't moved a muscle, but now his head was tilted. He was looking directly at her reflection. The second their eyes met in the mirror, he snapped his gaze down to the floor. A few days later, the pattern repeated. She was doing shoulder presses. She scanned the room. There he was, sitting on a lot pulled-down machine 40 feet away. The weight stack was completely still. He was just sitting there. What? Every time she glanced over, she'd catch the tail end of his stare before he darted his eyes away. It became a macabre game of hide and seek. He was always there, but he never lifted a single weight. He just positioned himself strategically across the gym floor, ensuring he always had an unobstructed line of sight to her. Then came the night she was back at the squat rack. She dipped down. She looked in the mirror. He was sitting right behind her. But this time, his hands were raised chest level. He was holding his smartphone, the black lens of the camera pointed directly at her. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, glaring daggers at him. He immediately dropped the phone to his lap and turned his head. The gym, once her sanctuary, now felt like a panopticon. She couldn't breathe without feeling the weight of his stare. One evening, she jogged around a tight corner to use the water fountain. She stopped dead. He was standing right there, just 3 feet away, like lurking in the blind spot. She gasped, startled. He looked down, keeping his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and silently brushed past her without a single word. She couldn't take it anymore. She flipped her schedule upside down, trading her 6:00 p.m. workouts for the desolate, quiet hours of 9:00 p.m. The first few nights, the gym was wonderfully empty. The phantom was gone. She exhaled. She had outsmarted him. Until Saturday night. She was out downtown, celebrating the weekend with a group of friends. The bar was a chaotic sea of warm bodies, loud music, and spilled drinks. She was standing near the back, laughing with her friends, when she casually glanced over her shoulder. Sitting alone at a tiny, dimly lit table crammed against the back wall, was a man in a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. It took her brain a second to process the facial features in the neon light. It was him. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was sitting in the corner of a crowded bar, staring directly at her. When he realized she had spotted him, he quickly dropped his eyes to the table. For 20 minutes, she covertly watched him. Every single time, she caught his eyes locked onto her silhouette. Terrified, she pulled her friends away, fleeing to another bar across town. She didn't see him for the rest of the night, but the invisible tether between them felt tighter than ever. The climax of this nightmare arrived 2 weeks later, under the canopy of a cloudy, gray afternoon. Near her house was a massive nature preserve, boasting miles of winding dirt trails cutting through dense woods. She loved running there during the day to clear her head. She strapped on her running shoes, pushed her headphones into her ears, and hit the dirt path. 10 minutes into the heavy foliage, she noticed the faint, rhythmic crunch of gravel behind her. Someone was jogging. At first, logic took over. It's a public trail. Other people run here. But after a full minute, her primal instincts started screaming. The footsteps weren't passing her. They weren't falling back. They were maintaining the exact, precise distance, pacing her. She tested the waters. She pushed her pace, striding faster. Almost instantly, the heavy crunch of the gravel behind her sped up to match. Panic flared in her chest. She accelerated again, breathing harder. The footsteps behind her matched the speed. She threw a terrified glance over her shoulder. Jogging just 20 yards behind her, head tilted down, hat pulled low, was a man with a heavy build. The exact build of the man from the gym. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, flooded her veins. She knew this trail. She knew that a quarter mile ahead, there was a sharp left turn, a steep, narrow dirt exit path that climbed up out of the woods and dumped onto a residential street. She didn't look back again. She dug her toes into the dirt and broke into a dead sprint. The second she did, the charade ended. The man behind her dropped, all pretense. The rhythmic jogging exploded into the violent, heavy pounding of a man sprinting at full speed. He was chasing her. She ran like she had never run in her life. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, the sound of his heavy, frantic breathing echoing behind her. He was closing the gap. She hit the sharp left turn, her shoes sliding in the loose dirt, and scrambled up the steep incline toward the daylight of the street. She burst out of the tree line onto the pavement, completely breathless, and immediately began screaming at the top of her lungs. "Help! Help me!" Across the street, a man washing his car in his driveway dropped his hose and spun around, alarm plastered across his face. The stalker broke through the tree line, just seconds behind her. But the moment his boots hit the pavement, he saw the man in the driveway pointing at him. The stalker froze. He stood at the edge of the woods, chest heaving, his face still hidden in shadow. He hesitated for one agonizing second. Then he spun on his heels and vanished back into the dark canopy of the preserve. By the time the neighbor ran across the street to help her, the woods were dead silent. She never saw him again. She canceled her Law Fitness membership the very next day, joining a different gym on the complete opposite side of town. But the damage was done. The psychological scar remained. Because when you realize how easily someone can slip into your life, memorize your habits, and wait for you in the dark. Wait. You never stop looking over your shoulder. Thank you for listening. Remember, be careful who you smile at. Be careful who you share your routine with. The world is full of strangers, and not all of them just want to say hello. Stay safe out there.